So I'm Francesca. Just so you know, this piece of research is an adapted version of my dissertation. I have a master's degree in gender policy and inequalities from the London School of Economics. This is working. Okay. So my research is about women who fought during the Lebanese Civil War in order to give them voice because they are traditionally invisibilized from accounts of history and of the war. So the questions I answer are women-centered in order to make women's experiences of war relevant, and I look at women's involvement in war as a political choice rather than a personal one. So the details of the Lebanese Civil War are very complex and they don't necessarily fall within the scope of my research, so I will only present two relevant players. The Kataeb was founded as a political party in 1936, and it was a strong player in Lebanon's independence struggle from the French mandate. And the Lebanese forces was established in 1976 as a joint command of all Christian right-wing militias. But after internal clashes, it became an independent militia in 1985. That's a bit of background. So my research looks at the roles and motivations of the women who fought within those militias and the way those roles were masculinized or feminized and with what consequences. I therefore answer the following research question. In what ways did militant women loyal to the LF, which is Lebanese forces, and or Kataeb militias embody masculine roles during the war? Masculine. How, if at all, did this create opportunities for further transgressions of traditional roles for Lebanese women and serve to advance their overall status? So I'll briefly go over my methodology, theoretical framework, and literature review before delving into my findings. In addition to reviewing existing literatures, I conducted 10 interviews with former fighters who are Lebanese Christian women, and I use a qualitative approach. So the aim of my research is not to be representative, but rather to give visibility to those women who are marginalized from accounts of the war. I also used a feminist methodology in order to understand the Civil War through those women's own interpretations, because I argue that the Civil War cannot be understood properly without unpacking its gender dynamics. So my research is based on two main theories. The first one is the theory of hegemonic masculinity developed by Connell in 1987, which basically argues that hegemonic masculinity is a dominant form of masculinity constructed on relations of power and dominance in opposition to subordinate masculinities and based on the subordination of women. The second one is a gender theorizing of war, which basically says that it is important to challenge assumptions in the way wars are traditionally conceptualized in order to uncover power relations and to use gender as a criteria of analysis in order to make women's experiences of war relevant. My literature review is divided into two main themes. The first one is gender, war, and militarization. So I first looked at military masculinity, and the literature is conclusive on the toxicity of military masculinity. And war is considered an exclusively masculine field. So agency is always associated with maleness, and powerlessness is associated with being female. Military masculinity is constructed on characteristics of domination, heroism, competitiveness, and aggressiveness. And it uses feminization as a tool for devalorization. So for example, in the Congolese National Army or in the Israeli Defense Forces or even the British Army, intelligence work or military administration work is feminized in order to place it as inferior. I also looked at the roles women are attributed during wars. So armies often use women by giving them support roles in order to do a number of different things, such as control their sexuality, extend their unpaid care work responsibilities, such as military wives or nurses, or to legitimize their projects. So motherhood is also a recurring theme, whereby mothers are depicted as mothers of the nation, producing martyrs and soldiers. Okay. In wartime, men's violence is often normalized, while women's violence is depoliticized. And this is what happened. Help. Okay. Okay. And this is characterized, and this is illustrated by three main narratives that are used while studying women's violence in traditional war histories. So first of all, the mother narrative uses motherhood as a motive for violence, for example, avenging men or protecting children. The monster narrative pathologizes women's violence and treats those women who engage in political violence as irrational and crazy. And the whore narrative depicts those women as being crazy, sex-crazed, deviant, or unable to provide men with sexual pleasure. The second theme of my literature is women and war in Lebanon. So in analyzing the literature of the history of Lebanon, patterns emerge on the way the war is often reported, which uses a typical way of reporting historical events, which does not consider women in an adequate light. Different forms of reports about the war exist, such as cinema and novels about the war, but yet again, with the exception of one film and one novel, all of those reports do not look at women. The main protagonists are always male, and with the exception of one case in the cinema and one case in the novels, there are no women in combat roles. Okay. The literature that does exist on Lebanese women in combat is very limited. So fighters are always portrayed as male, and women did engage in nationalistic battles, but only out of shortages and always as subordinates. Women militant faced a lot of obstacles due to the patriarchal nature of Lebanese society, and also due to their parents' refusals. However, the literature also argues that the war did open up opportunities for women to engage in new roles and in new spaces, which is what I look at. Okay, so now for my findings. I first looked at the motivations and perceptions of those women. So the Christian community at the time perceived a direct existential threat, and this is exemplified by the discourse that the women used. So they all said that they were there to protect their nation. They described the war as imposed, and they say that they had a cause to defend. I'm not sure if the audio will work. Can you try, please?
ما كان انت وكنت تصلي لذا تعوزك لو موتنا ولو ما حاربنا.
So I translated all the quotes, they're all written down, but this is just to give you a feel of what the women were saying. So this woman was saying that you would not be able to make the sign of the cross if we didn't fight. So basically, this represents the way the Christian community perceived a direct threat. And the cross is also very present. Okay. Second, since the entire community was mobilized at the time and those women's cases were considered as extraordinary, just like this quote will illustrate, this suggests that women were integrated out of need, and a lot of those women were joined the militias because their fathers or their brothers were already involved.
It was amazing بمجتمعنا هون ما كان حدا معود عليها especially إنه الجيش اللبناني ما كان عنده بنات يعني ما كان في بنات بالجيش ما كان في جنديات.
So using women out of need is typical for any militia or any army. However, I argue that analyzing those women at least's position as just that depoliticizes their actions, and the very fact that they took active part in the war is a transgression of social expectations. So for example, reducing their political engagement to family ties also depoliticizes their action.
مش بس لأنه خيي شاب بده يموت عني أنا بنت. Donc ما قبلت j'avais une cause, je suis là à côté des jeunes.
So geographic location also proves very interesting because most of the women who engaged in those militias were either born on the demarcation lines or had their villages surrounded at some point during the war. When it comes to perception, parents' decisions proved very important both in the literature and through fieldwork. Some women had to lie about their militia activities, which also repoliticizes their actions, while others were highly encouraged. When it comes to society, all interviewees stated that they were highly encouraged at the time of the war, except when it came to combat roles, because combat is always perceived as a masculine field that women can't enter. Furthermore, it's important to note that women were shamed after their militancy, after the war ended, but I will come to that later. Harsh military training conditioned women's recruitment, regardless of the role they held. However, a lot of women told me about how this training allowed them to gain a newfound sense of empowerment and of agency. But the pressure to conform and perform was also very toxic because many women chose to suffer, for example, from injuries in silence rather than to be alienated.
يعني أول شيء عم نتحدى حالنا وعم نتحديهم لأنه بدنا نثبت وجودنا ونفرجين إنه البنت قادرة توصل وقادرة تعمل.
Okay. I also looked at the internal gender dynamics of the militias, and when I asked the women about discrimination, they all stated that a family spirit and respect prevailed. So solidarity overcame harassment due to the importance of the cause, but also due to the extensive family networks within the militias and the traditional status of men as protectors of women and of the nation. Okay. So every woman I interviewed was given a support task, and a minority actually engaged in combat. So this woman talks about communications, for example.
أنا بسلك الإشارة لأنه هيدا الدومين أكثر شيء كان كمان.
I'm gonna have to go faster. Most women adopted a defensive style of fighting, focusing on reclaim rather than conquest. We can listen to the quotes later because I have to go faster. So I suggested a combination of the theory of hegemonic masculinity with that of military masculinity to study the hegemonic military masculinity of the decent Christian militiaman. Okay. So of course, militiamen were expected to be aggressive and heroic. However, something specific to those militia was respect and honor. And this is something that the women themselves expressed, which also shows the characteristics that they embodied as well. They were expected to express no fear, such as this quote, because some link this to being like men, which is also very essentializing. However, this is one of the characteristics that the Christian militiaman had to embody. Uniformity was another characteristic because women were expected to cut their hair and trim their fingernails, which could be considered transgressive, but at the same time, it shows how military masculinity is made to be the right and superior thing. So those women were able to transgress specific boundaries, however, with limits. For Christian militant women, post-war reintegration proved difficult because society did stigmatize them, like in any case, as the literature shows. However, the Christian community's perception after 25 years almost after the war does vary, and a large portion of this community now accepts those women's accomplishments. So just as a conclusion, So Lebanese Christian militant women were involved out of need because of the direct existential threat they felt. However, they successfully entered the male space. Harsh military training allowed them to gain a new sense of agency and empowerment, but at the same time, they mostly engaged in support tasks. Hegemonic military masculinity that those women embodied proved toxic, but they were able to transgress important social norms. And finally, they face difficult reintegration, and challenges are ahead for women in Lebanon. But those women's roles did open important doors for women in the country by allowing women to be perceived by society in a different light. So the question that remains now is how a better momentum can be created for the advancement of women in Lebanon outside of the context of war. And especially in a country that currently faces economic, political, environmental crises and that is surrounded by instability. Thank you.